Well, when it hit the stands in December of last year, Sabrina Erdely's Rolling Stone article, "A Rape on Campus," landed like a bombshell. In the article, Erdely tells the story of Jackie, not her real name. Jackie claimed to have been invited to a frat party at Phi Kappa Psi at the University of Virginia. At the frat house, Jackie's date, Drew, also not his real name, took her upstairs, where she says she was violently gang raped for over an hour by Drew and several of his fraternity brothers. Even more chilling was the university's response to the crime. Jackie reported the gang rape to school officials, who basically told her to keep quiet about it. Following the publication of the article, the university suspended all fraternities on campus. UVA professors were up in arms that fraternities were allowed to behave like this. The Phi Kappa Psi house was vandalized, and the fraternity members were forced to move out due to safety concerns. Protests broke out on campus demanding that something be done to address this fraternity behavior and this epidemic of sexual violence on that campus and campuses around the country. But then, Richard Bradley, the editor-in-chief at Worth magazine, wrote in a blog entry that he noticed some problems with the Rolling Stone article, glaring problems, as it were. Erdely had failed to interview any of the alleged perpetrators of the crime, which any good journalist should have done. She explained later that she couldn't find their contact information, that the fraternity's website was out of date. But other reporters persisted. Soon enough, the entire account of Jackie's gang rape began to unravel. Fraternity records showed that there had been no party on the night in question. No one could even identify some of the perpetrators involved. Jackie's testimony began to crumble, as she showed no physical indications of being beaten, as she'd claimed. Further reporting suggested this may have been a plea for attention for another boy. Eventually, Rolling Stone apologized for the story, admitted it failed basic journalistic ethics. Sure enough, Erdely's story was called by the Columbia Journalism Review the worst journalism of 2014. The fraternity is threatening to sue for damages and libel, and in the wake of Rolling Stone's apology and recant, feminists and others lament that the story has set back the case of rape victims by decades, making them think twice or three times about coming forward with a rape accusation that might even be more scrutinized and doubted now. Now, probably you've heard about the Rolling Stone article and the alleged rape at University of Virginia. I tell you that story to introduce our topic for the morning, which is important, complicated, divisive, and emotional. We're in a series right now called We've Got Issues, and during this series, as you know, we're looking at some hot-button issues in the news today that you hear about on the internet or on the news. We want to understand these hot-button issues better than we do, but we also want to understand them from a biblical and Christian perspective to see what God thinks, if anything, about these issues and what he's calling us as his people to do about them. So far, we've looked at several issues during the series. We looked at racial reconciliation in Ferguson. We've looked at illegal immigration. Last week, we looked at the Ebola panic. And this morning, we're going to be talking about another hot-button issue of the day, sexual assault on college campuses. Now, if you've been watching the news at all this past year, you know this issue has gotten quite a lot of attention, even before the Rolling Stone article. Sexual assault on campus is a terrible problem. According to the website 1in4.com, or 1in4usa.org, actually, to be accurate, 1 in 4 college women report surviving rape or attempted rape at some point in their lifetimes. 5% of women on college campuses report rape or attempted rape while in college. In U.S. military academies, 5% of women report rape or attempted rape at the academy, as do 2.4% of men. 28% of women in the military report being raped at some point during their military service. 28%. All told, every year in the United States, 1,270,000 women experience rape or attempted rape. As bad as those statistics are, the statistics on rape reporting are just as bad. According to a report done by Senator McCaskill, our senator here in the United States, or here in Missouri, who has made this one of her signature issues, she reports that less than 5% of rape victims report the crime to law enforcement, making rape the most underreported crime in our country. And of rapes that are reported, McCaskill reports that only 10% of cases result in the prosecution of defendants. Now, as terrible as those statistics are, critics point out that the situation is just not that simple. As the situation at Rolling Stone revealed, and as the situation at Duke University revealed, I think that was back in 2007, this is a more complicated story than we think. Critics insist that we just can't trust statistics on college rape. Because oftentimes there is no evidence for a crime and the situation is a matter of he said, she said. The notion of consensual sex is just hard to pin down. In many instances of alleged rape, memories are often impaired from alcohol, which makes getting to the truth of what happened even more difficult. At their harshest, critics argue that the college rape epidemic is a media-driven witch hunt that has created a culture of suspicion against men that is not deserved. As some pointed out in the aftermath of the Rolling Stone Eardley article, the probable reason that Sabrina Eardley did not interview any of the alleged fraternity rapists is because she assumed that as lascivious frat boys, they were surely guilty of the crime. She did not need to interview them. She'd already convicted them. This is the culture of suspicion that the media witch hunt, critics say, has created. It has also, critics argue, given women too much freedom to make accusations without evidence. Even Lena Dunham, the feminist author and star of Girls, is in a little bit of some trouble in this regard. If you know Lena Dunham, she's the star of Girls, and in her latest book, Not That Kind of Girl, she accuses a man named Barry of sexually assaulting her in college. People went looking for a Barry on campus and found one who was there while Dunham was a student. The man's life was turned upside down as he was assumed to have been the perpetrator. He said he had no relationship with Dunham, which Dunham even acknowledges. She says it was another Barry, but she hasn't given any other further details about who that Barry was. So the issue is complicated and divisive. Some argue that we need to do whatever we can to encourage victims of rape to come out, even if it means lowering our standards for proof and evidence. Others argue that while campus rape or any rape is a serious crime, we cannot neglect basic principles of jurisprudence, like being innocent until proven guilty and the importance of evidence over hearsay. Now, I understand both sides in this debate. Rape. It's a terrible, serious crime. Victims must be assured that their accusations will not be ignored. And even if the statistics aren't entirely accurate, few of us would disagree that any act of sexual violence is a crime that deserves to be punished to the fullest extent of the law. If the statistics are even somewhat accurate, then many of the women you and I know today have been guilty of sexual violence. Let's take that 1 in 4 statistic, that 1 in 4 of women at college are sexually assaulted at some point in their lifetimes. Taking that number and assuming that we average about 140 women here at Rooftop on a Sunday morning, and that let's say about half of those women go to college, that means that 14 of you have suffered some act of sexual violence. And if those statistics are true, and if we have about 80 girls here in our Rooftops Kids Ministry, and let's say about half of them go to college, then 8 of them will experience some act of sexual violence against them. Maybe my daughter, maybe yours. Those numbers may or may not be entirely accurate, but if that number is at all more than 0, we have a problem. At the same time, no matter how terrible this crime is, we can't forget the basic fundamentals of justice. Any defendant has a right to a fair hearing, is presumed innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, and must be convicted on the weight of the evidence, not mere accusations. Those are bedrock principles for a just society. That's why there are some current efforts to address this problem that everybody can agree on. For starters, and as you saw in the news report, legislators are identifying schools that have a poor track record of investigating rape claims. According to McCaskill's office, more than 40% of schools in the United States have not investigated a single rape claim in the past 5 years. And it's probably not because there haven't been any. Legislators are also working to help victims feel comfortable about coming forward and being subject to an examination, which takes great courage. They're working with college administrators to raise awareness of the problem to new students, to provide training and response teams on campus, and to provide support services to survivors and victims, all of which is actually surprisingly lacking. All these attempted solutions to the problem are worthwhile and they need to be tried. But our goal here during this series is not just to talk about the politics of these issues or the proposed solutions. Our goal is to try to discern what God thinks about this issue, or any issue, and what we can do about it. And when it comes to the issue of sexual assault in general, or rape in more particular terms, we know what God thinks about it. According to Scripture, rape is one of the most reprehensible and terrible crimes that one human being can commit against another. Take the story of Dinah in the Old Testament. In the book of Genesis, the author tells the story of Dinah, one of the daughters of Jacob by his wife Leah. One day, Dinah goes out to visit some friends of hers. While she is out in the fields, she's spotted by a man named Shechem, who likes what he sees. As the author writes, when Shechem, son of Hamor the Hivite, the ruler of that area, saw Dinah, he took her and violated her. It's a Hebrew euphemism for rape. Now, Dinah had 12 brothers. They loved Dinah very much. And when Dinah's 12 brothers heard about what had happened, they are infuriated and they rise to defend their sister. The author writes, her brothers were filled with grief and fury because Shechem had done a disgraceful thing in Israel with Jacob's daughter, a thing that should not have been done. Dinah's brothers actually devise a plot to get back at Shechem and his people. They convince Shechem that he and his people should become circumcised Hebrews so that God might forgive them for this crime. Otherwise, Dinah's brothers promise that they will kill all of them. Shechem and his men wisely agree to become circumcised to stay alive. Then, when they are recovering from the pain of their circumcision, Dinah's brothers sneak into camp and kill the lot of them. Now, that might not have been the best way to deal with the problem. But it does give us a glimpse of God's terrible fury on those who commit sexual assault. As the author writes, sexual assault is a disgraceful thing, a thing that should not be done. Rape, even the broader category of sexual assault, is a thing that just should not be done. Rape is the violent overpowering of another person and the stealing from them of what is their most sacred gift, intimate physical union with another human being. It's why the punishment for rape in the Old Testament was what? Death. When it comes to the issue of sexual assault on campus or at all, Christians should be standing up loud and clear that whatever the statistics are, whatever the legal issues are, this is a terrible thing that our society should just not tolerate. And yet, this is not a case that many Christians make. On this issue, many Christians remain awkwardly, tellingly silent. This is for many reasons, but probably because we know we lack credibility on the issue. Why do we lack credibility on the issue of sexual assault? Probably for many reasons. First, Christians tend not to handle feminist issues very well. Christians and feminists, not to draw a false dichotomy, I mean, you can be both, but generally speaking, Christians and feminists tend not to be buddies. Even though the first feminists, the first suffragettes, were devout believers, acting in service to God, Christians have shied away from so-called feminist causes for political reasons. And when Christians attempt to talk about feminist issues, they oftentimes sound like idiots. Take Todd Akin. Todd Akin was a conservative Christian candidate. Let's be gracious. Todd Akin was a conservative Christian candidate for the U.S. Senate in 2012. He made a fool of himself talking about legitimate rape, implying that there's such a thing as an illegitimate rape. He argued furthermore on national television that a woman's body has the ability to keep itself from becoming pregnant in the case of rape, even though, to my limited medical understanding, there is no medical study that has ever found that ever. Christians don't always handle feminist issues very well, so when we attempt to speak on them, we sound a little odd or even just offensive. Another reason Christians don't have a lot of credibility on the issue of sexual assault is because of the church's history of subjugating women. This is a complicated issue, but all sorts of Christians over the years have misused very difficult passages in the Bible to oppress and denigrate women, sometimes even violently. The world has noticed that and listens skeptically to us whenever we attempt to get involved in issues like this. Another reason the church doesn't have much credibility on the issue of sexual assault is because of our own hypocrisy when it comes to sexual violence. The problem of rape on campus is not limited to secular state universities. The problem takes place on Christian colleges all the time. And in some respects, Christian colleges deal with it even worse than secular universities do. Take the case of Samantha Field at Pensacola Christian College. Samantha was a student at Pensacola, a fundamentalist Christian college in Florida. In an online account of her time at Pensacola, Samantha reports being manipulated, verbally attacked, physically abused, raped, and stalked by her fiancé in college, who was also a student at the university. She broke off the engagement, went to a college counselor to ask what to do. The counselor was suspicious of her claim, thinking that this sort of thing just doesn't happen at Pensacola, and suggested that she had sinned by having premarital sex with her fiancé and that she needed to repent in order to be forgiven by God. Her ex-fiancé continued to harass and stalk her, and she asked for a different schedule and seating assignment to avoid him, but they wouldn't even allow it. They insisted that this is the sort of thing you need to work out between yourselves. Word got out that she was making these accusations, and her friends and classmates started ignoring her, disbelieving her story, drawing their own conclusions. The harassment from her ex got so bad that Samantha had to hide in a friend's apartment for the last 2 months of college because nobody at school would believe her or do anything about it. And it hasn't just happened at Pensacola either. Last year, a report came out at Bob Jones University, another fundamentalist Christian college. The report, which was actually invited by the university itself in a surprising display of transparency, identifies and interviews 141 current and former students who report being sexually assaulted on campus and being told by administrators it was because of something they did. 141. So as much of a problem as sexual assault on campus is, it's just not something Christians have a lot of credibility to discuss. The Christian community has a lot to think about before we jump in on this one. And that's actually what I think is most important for us to consider this morning. I want to suggest that Christians are as much a part of the problem as anybody is when it comes to this issue. I want to suggest that we Christians, you and I, are as much a part of the quote-unquote rape culture as anybody is here in the world. I know that sounds extreme, but let me explain. Rape culture, if you've heard that term, is a term used by feminists to describe certain societies in which rape happens at an alarmingly high rate. Countries like the United States, the UK, India, Pakistan, South Africa, other African countries. According to these feminist leaders, the rape culture of these countries makes rape more likely and more frequent. And it's hard to disagree when you look at the statistics. And they point out that certain aspects of our culture and society create these conditions. So what are the cultural components of rape culture? Well, let me share with you 3 of them and point out how even Christians contribute to this general culture, feeding the problem. For example, one of the cultural components of rape culture is the trivialization of the problem. By trivialization, I mean making the problem small instead of making the problem big. I mean that we don't recognize the widespread nature of the problem or that we downplay the seriousness of the matter. And by doing so, we give criminals permission to commit these crimes because they know it's not that big of a deal, they might not be caught. Or if they are, they might not be prosecuted. Take India. Rape has been an accepted, normal part of Indian culture for centuries. India is a very patriarchal society that tolerates rape, doesn't seem to care about the high rate of sexual assault among its own people. Throughout most of India, wives can't even accuse husbands of sexual assault because the government implicitly gives husbands that right. But something happened 2 years ago which has slowly started to transform this culture, maybe, possibly. In December of 2012, in South Delhi, a 23-year-old physiotherapy intern was gang raped on a bus by 6 men, including 1 juvenile. Her male friend was beaten with a metal rod, which was also used to rape the woman. She died 13 days later. Almost overnight, the entire nation of India wondered how their culture had come to allow this sort of crime. Demonstrations and rallies were held, and countries around the world pressured India to do something about the problem, which they are maybe trying possibly to do. But are we not hypocrites? Are we not guilty of trivializing this problem ourselves? I mean, on our college campuses, college men found guilty of sexual assault are routinely allowed to finish school with no consequences. The Catholic Church is well known for its reputation of ignoring sexual abuse and reassigning offending priests to another parish. When many Christian conservatives start discussing the issue, we begin by debating the statistics and insisting, it's a problem, but it's maybe not as big of a problem as we think. But rape is a problem. One rape is a problem. One act of sexual violence is a problem we must stand against. As Christians, we have to be willing to stand against sexual violence. We have to be willing to stand against sin, and sin is everywhere, and sin is a problem. One of the things that Jesus made sure to communicate when he came to earth is that we are all sinners, and we are all part of the problem, and that the problem of sin is much more terrible than we can even imagine, and there is no trivializing of the problem. Take what Jesus says in Matthew 5. He says, anybody who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Or what he says a couple verses later, anybody who thinks angry thoughts about somebody else is guilty of murder and will be subject to judgment in the fires of hell. Jesus doesn't trivialize the problem. Jesus magnifies the problem. Says, you are the problem. Jesus is calling us murderers, adulterers, rapists. Because he knows we're part of the problem. He doesn't trivialize it. He magnifies the problem, makes sure that we know we are the problem. We might never have assaulted anybody ever, but we're the problem. We don't want to believe that, though. So we downplay the problem. We debate statistics. And in the process, we let sin and rapists run rampant in our world. That's one of the cultural components of a rape culture, is trivializing the problem, which we do. Another one of the components of rape culture is the objectification of women. The objectification of women is, as you know, treating women like sex objects instead of the sacred, divinely crafted people they are, created in the very image of God. Once we start viewing women as sex objects, it becomes very easy, very subtly, to treat them like sex objects. Take another story, another terrible story in the Old Testament, of the rape of David's daughter Tamar by her half-brother Amnon. The story is told in 2 Samuel 13. In the story, David's son Amnon lusts after Tamar, David's daughter and Amnon's half-sister. He connives to get her alone in his bedroom where he rapes her. And after he commits this heinous act, he calls his servant to come into the room, and here's what he says. He says, "Get this woman out of here and bolt the door." Get this woman out of here. That was his sister. Get this woman. That's all she was to him at that moment, a woman. A place in which he could sate his sexual lusts. When he's done with her, he has her removed with the dirty sheets. When we view women as objects, it makes it easier to sin against them. When we fail to see their humanity, their personality, their divine image, it makes it easier to treat them like this. But this is what our culture encourages. We use women as sex objects to sell things all the time to arouse interest. This afternoon, we are going to see hundreds of midriffs, butts, and bosoms. We are basically this afternoon going to be watching together in a communal moment softcore pornography. Let's not pretend that's not what we're doing. Together as a community, we're going to be watching softcore pornography. But this is normal in today's culture. It doesn't shock us anymore. We would be shocked if a football game didn't include that. And there's nothing innocent about it. It's evidence that our culture is very, very far from God. And marketers and corporate moneymakers are using our lust to sell their goods, and it will work. We will give them our money because sex sells. But this is one of the root causes of sexual violence that we see happening all around us. When I was younger, I had a problem with pornography. You know that, even now. The temptation's always there. It was terrible. One of the things that pulled me from that addiction was when I started realizing that these models that I was infatuated with, and that I would stare at for hours, alone in the solitary of my bedroom, these models that I was just infatuated with, are people with names and families and problems and backgrounds Not names like Bunny and Jasmine, but real names. And when I realized that, I remember realizing that, it filled me with shame. People broken by their sin and led by their brokenness into this deplorable industry. And I realized that I'm as much a part of the problem as any adulterer or rapist because I'm committing the same sin they are. I'm treating them as less than the full and complete children of God that they are. I'm treating them as objects instead of sacred beings with divine personality. One more final component of rape culture is this. I don't think you'll be surprised by this. It's victim blaming. I'm sure you've heard this term before. Victim blaming in the context of sexual assault is when authorities or police or administrators shift responsibility away from the perpetrator onto the victim. They do this by asking the victims what they were wearing, how much they'd been drinking, what their relationship was with the alleged perpetrator. Victim blaming has terrible consequences in that it heaps additional feelings of shame and guilt onto victims. It also distracts from the fact that no matter what a woman is wearing or how much she had been drinking, the only one responsible for a rape is the rapist. This does not mean that it's a good idea to get drunk at a frat party while wearing skimpy clothes. I would never recommend that for anybody. I'm going to make sure my daughter understands that. There are some situations you just don't put yourself in. But by saying that, I am not at all exonerating aggressors from their crime. Skimpy clothing is not the problem here. The real problem is violent offenders who use power to take advantage of others in vulnerable positions. For some reason, though, Christians especially can be very good at blaming victims. We like blaming victims. This was the testimony of all those students at those Christian schools who claimed that they were blamed for the incident because of their own behavior. I think that we like victim blaming because it makes us feel better in an unpredictable, unfair universe. It makes us feel better to think that what happened to you is the result of something you did. But it's never that simple. Terrible stuff happens to people all the time that they didn't invite. You will be very glad to know that Jesus does not blame victims. Jesus doesn't blame victims for what happens to them. Jesus offers healing and hope for the victims of sin. Take the story of the blind man by the road. In John 9, Jesus and his disciples passed by a man who was blind from birth. The disciples asked Jesus, "Rabbi, who sinned that this man was born blind?" You know this story? That's an odd question. Right? Who sinned that this man was born blind? It's an odd question unless you understand the fact that back then, people really did think that sin and suffering and bad things that happened to you were the result of something that you did, that you reap what you sow. That was their theological orientation at the time. And this presented a little bit of a conundrum because he had been blind from birth. So how could he have sinned in the womb? So that's their question. It's a theological question to the rabbi, Jesus. Who sinned? Him in the womb, or does his parents sin? Because sometimes that happens too. Sometimes God takes out his wrath on our parents for their mistakes on us, they thought. Who sinned? Blaming the victim. But Jesus refused to play the victim-blaming game here. Jesus knows that sometimes terrible things just happen for no reason, and he knows that every crime and condition is not the result of somebody's sin or mistake. Furthermore, Jesus knows that every problem is a chance for God's power and glory to be demonstrated. As he says, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened so that the glory of God might be demonstrated in his life. And then while the disciples are debating on whose fault this was, Jesus reaches out and heals the man of his blindness. While we offer judgment and blame, Jesus offers hope and healing. That's why we're part of the problem here. While we're busy trying to figure out whose fault it was that this terrible thing happened, Jesus is busy nurturing and supporting that person, and that's our calling in these and any types of situations. When you have a hurting, broken soul in front of you, it's completely irrelevant who did what to whom. What matters is only how you can help them. know God's healing power. Let me close with a story this morning. I've already mentioned it, but I want to expand on it a little bit. One of the most terrible scenes in the life of King David is the one I've already mentioned, the rape of his daughter Tamar by his other son, Amnon, and Tamar's half-brother. Amnon was a lusty, angry fool who saw something that he wanted and he overpowered his half-sister. And Tamar knows that what is about to happen is a terrible crime. And in the story she cries out, "Don't, my brother. Such a thing should not be done." There's that phrase. It just should not be done in Israel. Don't do this wicked thing. After the rape, Tamar runs to her brother Absalom, who is furious with Amnon, and comforts his sister. And King David finds out about it too. The author writes, when King David heard all this, he was furious. And readers are primed to find out what King David, God's chosen vessel on earth, will do in response to his son's crime. Readers are ready to learn what hellfire David will call down from heaven to punish this wickedness. What will David do? Maybe you know what David did. What did David do? Nothing. He didn't do a thing. He loved his son too much. It is left to Absalom to kill Amnon and avenge his sister. And David pays for his inaction. He is stripped of his kingdom. And even though eventually he gets it back, his days are numbered. I think the ending of the story should force us to ask a question. When it comes to the issue of rape and sexual assault, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? We're going to repent of the way that we objectify women through pornography and media? Are we going to stop trivializing the problem and take more seriously the issues of violence and lust in our own hearts? Are we going to stop judging people when they need help and healing? Or are we going to do nothing? What are we going to do? We know what Jesus did. When Jesus saw the way we treat each other within our lust and our violence, he came down to earth to show us how to love, respect, and forgive each other. He taught us how to protect, honor, respect women. He offered his life as a sacrifice for our sins, the way we've been sinned against and the way we've sinned. And then he rose from the dead to show us that new life, a new life of hope and healing and joy is possible for anybody who believes. That's what Jesus came to do. That's how Jesus responded to the sin in our world, the sins of sexual violence. That's what he did. But what are we going to do? Let's pray.